There's no more important story that we can bring you than one that gives us a better understanding of the possibility and the perils of nuclear war, right? There was a time when media types and politicians were constantly cognizant of this, but these days it seems to not only be taken for granted, but actually bragged about. How many times, ask yourself, how many times don't you hear some irresponsible pundit, some politician or some so-called journalist from one country or another, or some party or another, rail about how their enemy should be, quote, nuked, as if it's just a word, without understanding that it would lead to the end of the world as we know it. This is a sobering topic. And here to share what she knows with us is NRS correspondent Farron Franczak, here to tell us about this leak from, of all people, Daniel Ellsberg. What is he actually leaking? What are we learning?
This is what he is leaking.
Wow.
All of this, okay? This is one of these things where we know him again from the Pentagon Papers, where he told the world, told mostly Americans, though, who it really mattered to, about how the U.S. government was lying to the American people about pulling out of Vietnam and about how they wanted to stay there much longer.
All true, by the way.
All true, yes. Now, in these documents, I'm going to pull up a map here for you so you can kind of see what we're looking at. The document notes, during the second Taiwan Straits crisis of 1958, Pentagon war planners believed that the islets of Quemoy and Matsu you see there, just a few miles from China's coast, were indefensible with conventional weapons. The entire military establishment assumed more and more that the nuclear weapons would be used in the event of hostilities. Now, the reason why Daniel Ellsberg is coming out with this, he says, as the United States moves to strengthen ties with Taiwan and de facto recognize Taiwanese independence, the geopolitical setup that created the second Taiwan Straits crisis, it must inevitably follow that the United States is once again preparing to fight a nuclear war with China. Now, he talks about Biden, not in these documents, obviously. This was back in the 1970s,
right,
but in the months since the inauguration, you have Joe Biden. He carried out kind of one of the most sweeping changes as far as the relationship with Taiwan since the adoption of the One China policy in 1978. Biden, he was the first American president to host Taiwan's ambassador at his inauguration. It's one of these things where he's starting to be a little bit more ambiguous with it. And what Ellsberg is saying is it's this kind of attitude is what's going to bring about more and more tensions with this. And again, like they said, had the conventional weapons not worked, they said we're going to have to do a nuclear drop and going as far north as Shanghai.
One final punctuation on this from you. The United States has military plans to probably attack every country on Earth,
right,
because they're just provisional plans. That's not what we're talking about here. There were actual military leaders in the U.S. military trying to make this happen at the time and pushing it to the brink of happening.
Right. And, a great quote from the former Secretary of State. You have it where he said the Cuban Missile Crisis is often described as the first nuclear crisis. Those of us who lived through the Quemoy crisis definitely regarded that as the first serious nuclear crisis.
So that's when it really happened,
right,
and we never knew. And this document is classified to this day.
And there's also talks about how it might have happened in 1985 as well. So when you were born and when I was born, there could have been bombs dropped.
Yeah, thank you for reminding everybody I was born in 1985.
No, I was going to say.
Thank you for that. I appreciate it. Farron Franczak, as usual. George Galloway, because, of any guest that we could possibly talk to on this day, George has actually put his neck on the line. He's actually stuck his chin out, as some would say, when it comes to standing up to people who don't take or consider the implications of war as maybe they should. So as we're looking at this scenario now, George, and learning that there may have been a nuclear war that we were this close to getting into in 1958, and seeing the same language being used today in this exchange between China and the United States over Taiwan, what thinketh you?
Well, I'm almost speechless. I have lived my whole life literally, because I was 8 years old when the Cuban Missile Crisis hit us, and when I went to bed thinking that the world might actually end tonight, because I had heard my parents talking about it. And now I learn that when I was 4 years old, we came much closer than we did in the Cuban Missile Crisis to the end of the world. For you're the only one who's put it bluntly. None of the other coverage of this will do so. A nuclear war means the end of the world. It means the end of all of us. And military leaders in the United States, this document reveals, were literally itching to get their finger on the trigger to set off a nuclear conflagration, first with China and then with the then Soviet Union, which would undoubtedly, indeed, was treaty bound to come to the defense of China. And that would have led to the end of the world. And yet we are discussing it here as if it were a piece of history. But there would have been no history if this cataclysmic event had happened. Now, you're also right to say it's important not just for its historical value, and God bless Daniel Ellsberg for giving it to us, but it's important because it might happen now in 2021. Anything can happen when you've got warships clogging up the Taiwan Straits and the South China Sea, when you've got alliances being formed that are quite explicitly alliances that are hostile to China. The only difference, Rick, is China is a lot more powerful in 2021 than it was in 1958.
Do you think that the people in power, in this case the Biden administration and others, understand the implications of this terse language going back and forth right now in consideration of the types of things that have happened historically?
Well, he ought to. First of all, he doesn't have the alibi of being Donald Trump. And secondly, he's old enough to know what war means. And that's conventional war, never mind nuclear war. So one assumes that wise counsels at the end of the day will still the hand of those that wish to provoke nuclear confrontation in the world. I like to think that Joe Biden is so wise, too wise, to be led down that road. I wasn't so confident about his predecessor, I've got to be perfectly honest with you. I thought that the impetuous nature of President Trump, the petulance, I often used to think, what if he gets into a temper or a rage some night? Then the world could end. Imagine that. I like to think that Biden is more sensible. But, Rick, accidents happen.
Yeah.
The pieces are all in place. And all it needs is an unruly or insubordinate military officer somewhere, or someone falling on the switch. And then you've got an exchange of weapons, and then you don't know where that's going to end.
Yeah, that's so important. Important words. Thanks so much, George. I appreciate the conversation and the sobering conversation. Let's continue now with